Well, welcome back to session one, part three. I'm sorry if you were watching part two, you'll notice that it abruptly ended. I sometimes forget that I'm talking and the 15 minutes is up, so I don't know what else to say other than it was my fault. A couple things I want to do is one is I want to remind everyone, and let me just go back to the first slide if I can. There's a way to do that, which I can't remember now. Anyway, if we were to go all the way back to the beginning, which I'm just going to do quickly, just want to remind everyone that I'm borrowing the outline for this from Slemzinski and Temesco-Dubrow. Please see this website if you want more information about their cross-national studies work. We were talking when we last met, just a few minutes ago, about what is a nation state and what would a nation without states look like. And I was saying that this would be something for further discussion when we're together at some point. But in the meantime, a nation state that's often used as an example is Japan. And there are many others, and I would hope that you could think of some others. Japan is one of those weird nations in that much of the population is of the same, this is when we come back, ethnic origin, language, culture, religion, self-identification, even though Japan is home to many minority groups from Korea and from China, and from, there's an indigenous group called the Ainu. So there are certainly groups within Japan, but it's often held up as an example of a nation and a state that have overlapped to a very significant degree. A nation without a state or a stateless people could be the Kurds. The Kurdish group overlaps between Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. I think I've got that correct. Please let me know if I'm wrong. But the Kurdish people have been without a state for a long time, and that means that they do not have this formal government organization which is used to both rule the people as well as define the limits of the Kurdish nation. There is a tendency, I think most of us maybe agree, to equate the nation with a cultural entity and a state with a political entity. And I think that those stereotypes are broadly true, although they certainly won't always be true. So if we say nation state, in the case of Japan, for example, we're talking about culture overlapping with state entities. If we talk about nation without states or stateless people like the Kurds, we're saying that the culture and the state are not coterminous. In fact, it's often relying more on a culturally or ethnically affiliated group that does not have a state. So what are the characteristics of a state? Well, we have several here. It's a territory with internally recognized boundaries. It has sovereignty, meaning that no other state has power over the country's territory. There are people who live there on an ongoing basis, so it's not just an empty island. There's a government which provides police, army, regulates foreign and domestic trade, issues money, has an education system. I should put that here usually. It has a transportation system for moving goods and people, and there's usually externally recognition. This voted into the club comment. It has to do with legitimacy. Country is another way that we can talk about cross-national comparison, and commonly the term is used casually in the sense of both nation and state. But if we're talking about just political geography, the world is divided into independent states and other territories, which are often dependencies in areas of special sovereignty. So it's a more casual term for a nation state. Independent states, there are roughly 192 countries that are known as independent states as members of the UN, and 65 countries that are called dependencies and areas of special sovereignty. Those would be areas that are territories or other sorts of states or nations that have special relations with other states. So in practice, cross-national research often means research restricted to subsets of independent states, although I'll be honest, in comparative international education quantitative research, we have all sorts of comparisons that take place across both independent and dependent states. And part of the reason for that is that we're usually looking at education systems. And education systems, and we're comparing across those systems, those can be coterminous with the country or the nation state, or they can be defined by sub-regions, political states within a country. So I'm sitting in the state of Pennsylvania, which is in the United States. Technically, it's the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but you get my point. And so we could take the data for the Pennsylvania education system and compare it with, quite frankly, other countries that have similar sizes and characteristics. Robert Marsh in Comparative Sociology defines society as a plurality of interacting individuals that has the following four characteristics. There's some sort of a definite territory. There's some sort of sexual reproduction that takes place within that in order to reproduce members of society. There is a comprehensive culture, and there's usually political independence. But as you can tell, these are very mushy terms. In other words, you can take them and define them in a variety of configurations and of many different degrees in terms of what does it mean to define territory. So in the last part 2 video, I was talking about sort of this culture that extends across the United States and Canada that is somehow unique in some ways from the culture that is in Mexico, even though we're all part of the North American continent. And although there is a lot of influence of Mexico that takes place within the United States in particular, there is a greater affinity or a greater comprehensiveness of culture between Canada and the United States in many, I think, Americans' perceptions, even though that might not necessarily be the fact. So when we talk about society, we're trying to group together people based on territory, reproduction, or membership, culture, and politics. So how do we count and compare societies? In other words, what is the universe of societies through space and time? Remember our XT/XS, cross time, cross space. The estimate is that the universe of societies consists of about 5,000 units, and these vary in size from about 100 people of primitive hunting bands to over 1 billion people of contemporary China. If we looked at Murdoch's World Ethnographic Sample in 1957, he was the first one who made a comprehensive attempt to map the universe by selecting 522 independent societies. But it's a little murky, as we were just pointing out on this previous page, in terms of what defines a society and whether or not they're comparable across societies. In other words, I wouldn't necessarily compare primitive hunting bands with contemporary China. So we've talked about some of the units of comparative and international education. I just want to, one more time, say that we've talked about nation states, countries, societies, and to some extent systems. And let me just spend a minute talking about education systems. Education systems are, again, one of the units we often use to compare education across different spaces. But the education systems themselves are usually aligned with or affiliated with states. In other words, education systems are the product of governments and politics. It's much more rare to find education systems that are nationally oriented without any state involvement. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that education systems require some sort of money in order to exist, and that often comes from taxes that are levied by the states. So it's a financial model as well as a governance model that produces the importance of education systems for our comparative and international education research. It also means that if we're defining education systems, it's usually going to overlap with what we would call nation states. So states and nations that are somehow more overlapping or more coterminous than each might be independently. So the countries idea. The countries are often overlapping with educational systems. Pardon me, I have a little bit of a cold. Okay, I also want to talk a little bit about different approaches to cross-national research. There is certainly a typology that takes into account the nature of dependent variables and independent variables. This is also coming from our friends, just going back to the beginning, Slavinsky and Tomesco Dubrau. So let's keep them in mind as we move forward on this.